I salute the light that does not burn the forest, but incinerates the heart of the greedy. From the deep waters of the Tanawa, we now ascend to the flooded lands and dense forests where heat becomes spirit. To narrate the journey of the Boitatá, we enter the pulsating and humid heart of the Americas. Chapter 1, The Memory of Light in the Womb of Night. I was not born of fire, I was born of the hunger for light. There was a time when the sun hid in absolute darkness, the Inipabu took over the world. The sky was a mantle of pitch and the earth, a sea of mud and death. While the other animals died of terror, I crawled through the swamps, searching for what remained of the world's brilliance. I did not eat meat. I sought eyes. Each animal that fell into the swamp held in its pupils the last image of the sun they had seen. I swallowed them one by one. Not out of malice, but so that the light would not be lost in the mud. Thousands of eyes, thousands of tiny suns ended up inside me. The miracle happened in the silence of the cave. My body, once dark and cold, began to radiate light. My skin became crystalline, and the fire I had gathered transformed into a flame that does not consume the wood, but consumes the soul. I became Boitatá, the serpent of fire. When the sun finally returned, I was no longer an ordinary snake. I was the guardian of the light. I received a mission from the ancient spirits, to be the eye that watches over the forest when men sleep or when they think that darkness will hide their crimes. I am the fire that lives within the water and the light that shines in the swamp. I am proof that the forest is never blind. But centuries passed, and the light I guard began to burn differently. The fire of memory became the fire of justice. And the first arsonists were about to discover that there are flames that water cannot extinguish. The fire that man carries in his torch is a hungry fire, devouring indiscriminately. My fire is different, it is intelligent. It knows how to distinguish the dry branch that falls to nourish the soil from the tree that is felled by greed. Chapter 2, The Blinding Gaze and the Justice of the Swamp. There was a hunter who entered the forest during the new moon. He was not seeking food for his tribe, he was seeking hides to sell and trophies to display. To clear a path and scare away the beasts, he threw embers onto the dry grass. He laughed as the small flames began to bite into the roots of the kapok trees. I felt the heat. But not the heat of the sun, it was the heat of destruction. I glided through the swamp like a ray of liquid light. I made no sound, but the air around the hunter began to vibrate. The smell of sulfur and ozone filled his lungs. He stopped, feeling that the temperature had risen, but the fire he had started was still far away. Then I rose. My form was a spiral of blue and gold flames. My eyes, nourished by 1,000 generations of light, fixed on his. The hunter screamed. He tried to fire his weapon, but his hands trembled like leaves in the wind. "Look at me," I said, not with words, but with the pressure of my brilliance. Whoever looks at the Boitatá sees not just a snake. They see all the lives that the forest harbors. They see the cycle of water, the birth of seeds, and the end of empires. The human mind was not made to withstand the totality of light. The hunter did not burn on the outside. But inside, his eyes were forever blinded. He left the forest groping in the air, screaming that the sun had pursued him among the trees. He never again harmed a plant, for now he lived in a world of shadows, haunted by the memory of the shining serpent. I returned to the river, letting the fire he had started die out on its own, for where the Boitatá passes, ordinary fire dies of shame. But the world of men has changed. They stopped coming with torches and began to come with chains and iron machines that spew black smoke. They no longer fear blindness, for they are already blinded by greed. The machines arrived not with the fire that warms, but with the iron that crushes. They had no eyes for me to blind, nor a soul for me to haunt. They were metal monsters, driven by a thick, black blood that smelled of ancient death. Wherever they passed, the forest fell silent, and the trail they left was an open wound in the earth. Chapter 3, The Will-o'-the-Wisp Against the Iron Machine. I watched from the edge of the flooded forest. The young men wore clothes that hid their skin and machines that roared louder than the jaguar. They destroyed in minutes what sunlight took centuries to build. They called it progress, but I saw only emptiness. I tried the old tactic. I rose like a column of flames among the trees. But the machine operators didn't look at the forest, they looked at their panels and levers. They didn't feel the sacred, only the output. Then I understood that to stop the metal, I needed to become the illusion. I transformed myself into a million tiny lights, like giant fireflies, and danced across the swamp's surface. I created the image of solid ground where there was only quicksand. I lured the giant wheels of the excavators into the mud traps I myself had guarded. One by one, the machines began to sink. The metal groaned as the swamp embraced it. Black oil leaked, but I enveloped each drop in purifying fire, preventing the poison from spreading to the heart of the waters. The men panicked. Their radios crackled with interference that sounded like whispers in ancient Tupi. They saw the Boitatá everywhere, in every reflection in the puddle, in every spark that flew from the overheated engines. I was no longer just a snake, I was the spirit of mechanical failure. "The forest is alive," shouted one of them before abandoning his post. They fled, leaving behind the iron that now belonged to time and rust. But as I cleaned the wounds in that clearing, I realized something terrible: the heat of the world was changing. It wasn't my fire, nor the fire of the torches. It was an invisible heat, coming from all sides, drying up the springs and making the air heavy. The Boitatá, the serpent that guarded the light of the flood, was about to face its greatest challenge: the fire that has no face. The heat that now rose from the earth was not the embrace of the sun, nor the purifying flame of my womb. It was a dry heat, a fever from afar, evaporating the sweat from the leaves before it even arose. The springs, which for millennia had been my havens of coolness, began to yawn dust. Chapter 4: The Agony of the Springs and the Global Heat. I, who am made of light, felt the darkness in a new way. It was not the lack of brightness, but the death of moisture. The Boitatá is a fire serpent, but its soul belongs to the waters. I am the balance between ardor and dew. Without water to bathe me, my fire becomes heavy, a burden that threatens to consume me. I saw the great rivers of the Amazon recede like dry veins in an exhausted body. I saw the dolphins trapped in pools that boiled under the new sky. The global heat was the faceless fire, an enemy I couldn't look in the eye to blind it, for it was everywhere and nowhere. In this moment of agony, I understood: man was no longer setting the forest ablaze with torches, he was setting the very air ablaze with his unbridled existence. My blue flames began to flicker. I crawled through the dry riverbeds, feeling the scales of light scratch the cracked clay. Wherever I went, plants tried to cling to my glow, seeking a life that the sky no longer gave them. If the world becomes a desert, I thought, my light will have nothing to protect. I will be just a lonely flame in a void of ashes. That's when I made an ancient decision. I would not fight the heat with more heat. I would use my essence to become the watcher of evaporation. I began to circle the last sources of pure water, creating a barrier of cold light that prevented the sun from carrying away the last drops. I became the guardian of the wet in the kingdom of the dry. But I knew that the Boitatá alone would not overcome the planet's fever. I needed men, not those who destroy, but those who remember, to see what I was seeing. I needed to transform my light into information. The metal lenses that now orbit the world try to capture everything in numbers and pixels. They look at the forest from above, trying to measure how much life still remains under the smoke. What they don't know is that sometimes what they register as an anomalous heat spot is not a fire, but my passage. Chapter 5: The Glow in the Satellites and the Science of the Sacred. There was a night when the sky was clear, but the earth burned with fever. On the screens of the control centers, 1,000 kilometers high, the infrared sensors detected something impossible: a line of fire moving against the wind, a serpent of light that left no ashes in its wake. I learned to use the technology of men against their own blindness. I allowed myself to be seen. I shone with an intensity that no satellite could ignore. I traced, with my will-o'-the-wisp body, the paths where deforestation was deepest, the routes where criminals hid their saws. I became a data beacon. Those who love the earth and use science to defend it began to notice. They called it a bioenergetic phenomenon, atmospheric luminescence, or sensor error. But deep down, the descendants of the forest knew the real name. The Boitatá is showing us where to begin the healing, the researchers whispered. At this stage of my journey, I ceased to be just a swamp monster and became geospatial consciousness. I began to inhabit not only caves, but also codes and satellite images. I am the anomaly that points to where life is crying out for help. But this new form of struggle demands a price. By exposing myself to the lenses of the world, I became the target of cold curiosity. Those who do not respect the sacred now want to capture me, study me, bottle my light to sell in energy tanks. They think they can possess the fire that was born from the darkness of the flood. They forget that the fiery serpent has a venom that does not kill the body, but incinerates the sanity of those who try to tame the untamable. The men who now seek me no longer bring torches or chainsaws, they bring networks of sensors and cameras that see heat. They want to unravel the formula of my light, they want to transform Boitatá into a source of energy, into an object under the microscope. They call it discovery, but I call it invasion. Chapter 6: The Poison of Truth and the Vertigo of Men. I allowed a team of scientists and explorers to get close. They set up camp in the heart of the swamp, surrounded by artificial lights that tried to obscure my own brightness. They spoke of photon capture and thermal signatures. I did not attack them with fire. I attacked them with truth. My poison does not run on bone fangs, it travels through the light I emit. When they pointed their high-powered lenses at my body, I did not flee. I stopped. I opened myself up like a fan of 1,000 suns and let each camera drink in the totality of who I am. The result wasn't a clear image, but vertigo. On the screens, what appeared wasn't a snake, but the reflection of every sin those men had committed against the world. The heat sensor didn't register degrees Celsius, it registered the weight of remorse. One of the scientists, looking at the viewfinder, saw the image of the forest he had helped to cut down to build his laboratory. Another saw the trail of plastic he left in his wake. They began to feel the nausea of the spirit. The poison of truth acts like this, it forces you to see the world without the filters of human excuse. "The light is changing us," shouted the expedition leader, knocking down the equipment. They felt the ground vibrate beneath their feet. It wasn't an earthquake, it was the heartbeat of the earth, which I amplified through my brilliance. They realized I wasn't a thing to be studied, but a judge who was studying them. The expedition was abandoned. The files were corrupted by a light that no digital memory could contain. They returned to their cities, but they were never the same again. Their eyes now shone with a remnant of my color, and they dedicated their lives to protecting what they once only wanted to catalog. The Boitatá no longer needs to devour the eyes of the dead. Now, I am opening the eyes of the living, and the light I plant in them burns brighter than any wildfire. Chapter 7, The Dance of the Cold Flames. I grew weary of the weight of the metal and the smell of the oil. To cleanse the atmosphere of my own fury, I plunged into the heart of the virgin forest, where man has not yet dared to strike a match. There, I performed the dance of the cold flames. That night, I was not a hunter. I was the pulse of the forest. I began to spin among the kapok and chestnut trees, my fiery body coiling around the trunks like an ivy of light. The dry leaves on the ground did not combust, on the contrary, they shone with a silvery hue. The fire I emit in Chapter 7 is the fire of regeneration. Wherever I touched with my brilliance, life accelerated. The seeds dormant in the soil felt the mystical heat and broke their shells. The animals of the night, instead of fleeing, drew near to bathe in the light that heals the wounds of past hunts. The air became electrified, charged with pure ozone that cleared the smoke from distant fires. The cold flame is the Boitátá's greatest paradox. It teaches that there is a power that is immense, but that does not destroy. It is the power of active preservation. I showed the forest that its protector was still strong and that the sunlight, which I kept in my belly during the Great Flood, was still available to nourish the future. The forest peoples, observing from afar, saw the treetops illuminated by a bluish glow that produced no smoke. They knew that balance had been restored in that region. But the dance has a greater purpose. I was recharging my spiritual batteries for what was to come. For the Boitatá now understands that its light cannot be restricted only to the trees, it needs to invade the cities, the dreams, and the thoughts of those who decide the fate of the planet. I was about to cease being a snake and become an incendiary ideal. Chapter 8, The Fire That Leaps into the Mind. I left the riverbanks and the shadows of the treetops. I fragmented myself into billions of invisible sparks that travel not through the air, but through intuition. In Chapter 8, I transform into the fire of ideas. You know that flash of clarity that arises when someone decides to change their life? That flame of indignation that burns in the chest of a young person when witnessing a crime against the earth? That is me. I began to ignite consciences. The spark of empathy, I enter the dreams of those who are distant, making them smell the damp earth and feel the terror of real flames, transforming indifference into action. The glow of invention, I whisper in the minds of engineers and architects, inspiring technologies that imitate nature instead of enslaving it. I am the light behind the energy that does not burn the future. The combustion of fear, I transform the fear of the climate crisis into burning courage. The fire that once blinded the invaders now illuminates the path of the defenders. At this stage, the Boitatá becomes a virus of light. I leap from person to person through words, art, and acts of resistance. If a man plants a tree with the intention of protecting future generations, my scales glow in his hands. I am no longer just a snake in the swamp, I am the collective will for survival. However, as this fire spreads, the resistance of darkness also increases. Those who profit from the grayness and coldness of the soul try to stifle this flame with lies and distractions. The final battle will not be in the Amazon, but in the soul of humanity. Chapter 9 is the ultimate expansion. It is the moment when the Boitatá ceases to be a terrestrial phenomenon and becomes a cosmic force. If in the beginning I ate the eyes of animals to preserve the light, now I become the eye that watches over the entire planet from the stars. Chapter 9, The Serpent Constellation and the Universal Gaze. At this stage, my fiery body no longer crawls only through the mud, it projects itself into the firmament. I transform into the constellation of vigilance. For the ancients, I was the will-o'-the-wisp, for the moderns, I am the light in the satellites, but for the spirit, I am the network of light that envelopes the earth. In Chapter 9, the Boitatá becomes proof that the intelligence of nature is universal. The lesson of this stage is the transcendence of protection. The fire that unites, I connect the river dweller of the Amazon to the activist in the concrete jungles. My light now travels at the speed of thought, uniting all those who swore not to let the world fade. The gaze from above, I see that the borders of men are imaginary, but the wounds of the earth are real. My brilliance now serves to show that the protection of a tree in Brazil is the protection of the air across the globe. The immortality of the myth, I understand that, even if my physical serpent body could be wounded, the ideal of the Boitatá is indestructible. I have become a solar archetype that inhabits the unconscious of every living being. I am the midnight sun of ecology. When all seems lost and the darkness of the climate crisis seems absolute, I shine brighter. I am the reminder that the light I consumed in the original flood is still here, protected within me, waiting for the moment to rebuild the world. I am no longer just a punishing snake, I am the incendiary hope. I am proof that light always finds a way to survive, even in the belly of the hungriest serpent. Chapter 10 is the spiritual plasma state. It is where the duality between the fire monster and the observer disintegrates. At 10, there is no longer a snake to be seen, because you have become clarity itself. Chapter 10, the melting point and the perpetual flame. In this final stage, the Boitatá performs its last metamorphosis trick. It ceases to be an external creature and merges with your DNA. The fire I have guarded since the flood is no longer in the swamp, it has been transferred to your will. The mystery of Chapter 10 is the radiant unity. I have always been a mirror. The brilliance that blinded the greedy was merely a reflection of their darkness. The brilliance that guided the protectors was a reflection of their inner light. Now, the mirror shatters, and what remains is the essence. The ultimate lesson of the Boitatá is that protecting the earth is not an external task, but a condition of being. You are the eye, you now see the forest, the sea, and the rivers not as resources, but as extensions of your own body. When the earth is wounded, you feel the heat of indignation. When it flourishes, you feel the brilliance of peace. The unquenchable fire, the courage you feel in defending what is right is my tongue of fire licking your soul. This flame does not depend on external fuel, it feeds on your integrity. The return to the sun, the cycle closes. The light I began to collect in the darkness of the beginning of time is now returned to the world through each of your gestures of care and respect. The Boitatá rests. I become the warmth that keeps your heart beating and the light that allows you to see the truth behind the shadows. The serpent of fire no longer needs to wander the forest, for it has found its ultimate home, awakened human consciousness.